On the night of February 10th, 1567, a catastrophic gunpowder explosion flattened the Kirk residence, where King Consort Henry Stuart was convalescing. The cause of this tragedy originated 11 months prior. Stuart led assassins into the pregnant queen's private chambers, ruthlessly ordering the 56-stab execution of her close secretary to exert pressure and display his dominance. This reckless act of intimidation caused the entire Scottish nobility and his own wife to turn against him. The incident at the Kirkfield residence was not a spontaneous plot, but a meticulously scheduled purge. The man who once sowed fear with edged weapons ultimately died in silence on a desolate lawn. In the mid-16th century, the British Isles were deeply divided by religious conflicts, economic instability, and royal rivalries. Nations like England, Scotland, France, and Spain locked themselves in a constant struggle for dominance. During this era, religion was not just a personal belief system. Leaders actively used faith as a political tool. They used it to justify foreign wars, fuel domestic rebellions, and order royal assassinations. In the South, Protestant Queen Elizabeth I ruled England from a precarious position. The major Catholic powers of Europe considered her an illegitimate ruler with no right to the throne. They strictly refused to recognize her father Henry VIII's controversial divorce and subsequent marriage to Anne Boleyn. Consequently, Elizabeth spent her early reign constantly defending against Catholic plots, assassins, and foreign invasions. In the north, Catholic Mary, Queen of Scots, faced an equally unstable political landscape. She returned to Scotland in 1561 to rule a nation undergoing a sweeping, violent Protestant shift. Her kingdom was heavily controlled by fiercely independent Protestant nobles. These lords, including her half-brother the Earl of Moray, regularly manipulated or threatened the monarchy to protect their own wealth and power. During this period, royal marriages functioned as strategic military alliances rather than romantic unions. A strong royal bloodline could easily destabilize a rival government or trigger a devastating war. Into this tense political climate stepped Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley. His parents had raised him with a singular, ruthless goal to exploit these national vulnerabilities and ultimately capture both the English and Scottish thrones. Born on December the 7th, 1545, at Temple Newsam in Yorkshire, Darnley was primarily a political tool for his ambitious family. His parents treated his royal lineage as a calculated asset, meant to restore their lost power. His strong royal ties posed a direct legal threat to both Queen Elizabeth and Queen Mary. He was essentially a living weapon, designed to challenge Britain's rulers. Darnley's father was Matthew Stuart, the 4th Earl of Lennox. Lennox was a disgraced nobleman who lived in forced political exile. Despite his fallen status, his family held a very strong, legitimate claim to the Scottish crown through their direct descent from King James II. However, Lennox had previously gambled his political standing and lost his wealth during the conflict known as the Rough Wooing. During the 1540s, King Henry VIII of England had launched a devastating series of military campaigns against Scotland. His goal was to force the Scots to agree to a marriage between the infant Mary, Queen of Scots, and his son, the future Edward VI. While most Scottish nobles fought fiercely against the English invasion, the Earl of Lennox saw an opportunity for personal advancement. He defected. Lennox sided with Henry VIII, betraying his homeland in exchange for English gold, lands in Yorkshire, and a strategic marriage. The Scottish Parliament's retribution was swift and total. Matthew Stuart was convicted of high treason. He was stripped of his Scottish nationality. His vast estates were confiscated by the crown, and he was banished under pain of death. For 22 years, the Earl of Lennox lived in English exile, nursing a deep, festering resentment. He viewed his son, Darnley, as the ultimate instrument of his revenge. The boy was the key to unlocking the doors of Edinburgh and reclaiming his stolen birthright. If his father provided the motive of revenge, his mother provided the lethal royal pedigree. Lady Margaret Douglas was a woman of terrifying ambition and formidable intellect. She was a survivor of the deadliest court in European history. Margaret was the daughter of Archibald Douglas, 6th Earl of Angus, and Margaret Tudor. Margaret Tudor was the older sister of King Henry VIII of England. This made Lady Margaret Douglas the niece of Henry VIII. It also made her son, Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, the great-grandson of King Henry VII, the founder of the Tudor dynasty. Lady Margaret Douglas had spent her life navigating the lethal paranoia of the Tudor court. She had been imprisoned in the Tower of London multiple times by her uncle, Henry VIII, for unauthorized romances and political maneuvering. She learned early that in the Game of Thrones, you must either seize power or be crushed by it. She survived by cultivating a network of Catholic sympathizers. From the shadows, she meticulously plotted her family's eventual rise to the apex of British power. When she married the exiled Earl of Lennox, it was not a union of passion. It was a merger of two sidelined royal factions aiming to create a bloodline that could override all others. The marriage between Matthew Stuart and Margaret Douglas produced a child who represented a profound political threat for the sitting monarchs of both England and Scotland. Henry Stuart possessed a dual claim that was legally and biologically extraordinary. On the Scottish front, Darnley carried the ancient blood of the Stuarts. Should anything happen to Mary, Queen of Scots, and the rival Hamilton faction be neutralized, Darnley possessed a direct, undeniable, and legally sound claim to the Scottish crown. He represented the return of the exiled Lennox line. This prospect deeply unsettled the established Protestant lords who had seized Lennox properties during the Earl's banishment. However, it was on the English front that Darnley's pedigree was most lethal. Queen Elizabeth I was unmarried and childless. This was an unprecedented and inherently unstable situation for a 16th century monarch. The English line of succession was an open, bleeding question that invited endless conspiracy. Mary, Queen of Scots, was widely considered the most senior heir to the English throne. She was also descended from Henry VIII's sister, Margaret Tudor. However, Mary Stuart had a glaring legal disadvantage in the eyes of English jurisprudence. She was a foreign national. Under English common law, specifically the precedents surrounding the inheritance of property by foreigners, there was a strong, fiercely debated legal argument. It stated that no foreign-born individual could inherit English lands, let alone the English crown. This is where the birth of Henry Stuart at Temple Newsam in Yorkshire became the ultimate trump card. Darnley was native-born on English soil. He was an English citizen. In the complex and litigious legal landscape of the era, this native status gave Darnley a formidable, arguably superior legal foundation to claim the English throne over his cousin Mary. To the English Catholic nobility who despised Elizabeth's Protestant reforms and desperately wanted a return to the old faith, Darnley was the perfect candidate. He possessed the royal Tudor blood. He was biologically male, which was heavily preferred by the patriarchal structures of the time. He was raised by a staunchly Catholic mother, and he was undeniably English by birth. For Queen Elizabeth I, Darnley was not just a troublesome cousin, he was a walking, breathing security risk. His mere existence provided a legal alternative to her rule, making him a permanent magnet for treason and rebellion. Elizabeth kept the Lennox family under constant surveillance. She heavily restricted their movements and employed spies within their household to monitor their communications with foreign powers and domestic dissidents. Darnley did not grow up in a typical aristocratic household. He was raised in a center of Catholic dissidents. The estate at Temple Newsam functioned as a shadow court for English Catholics and disgruntled nobles who felt marginalized by Elizabeth's Protestant regime. From his earliest days, Darnley was meticulously molded by his mother with a singular obsessive goal. He was not raised to be a loyal subject of the Queen. He was raised to replace her. Lady Margaret Douglas instilled in her son a profound, unwavering belief in his own supreme destiny. She constantly reminded him of his royal blood, systematically brainwashing him with an ideology of extreme bloodline supremacy. She convinced him that the thrones of both England and Scotland were not just political possibilities, but his natural, divine, and unalienable rights. They were currently being occupied by weaker women who would eventually be swept aside by history. This environment of toxic indulgence and immense pressure had a catastrophic effect on the boy's psychological development. Rather than instilling a sense of duty, gravity, or the heavy responsibility of statecraft, this grooming nurtured a monstrous sense of entitlement and a profound lethal arrogance. Henry Stuart grew to believe that his mere existence was a gift to the world. He believed that he did not have to earn respect, build alliances, or demonstrate competence. His blood alone demanded unwavering obedience from everyone around him. The parents had successfully molded the ultimate dynastic tool to target the crowns of Britain. But in their obsessive focus on his pedigree, they failed to recognize that the weapon they had forged was fundamentally unstable. They had created a prince who was ravenous for power, yet entirely devoid of the character, intelligence, or discipline required to wield it. The stage was set, the bloodlines were secured, the boy was preparing to step out of the shadows of Yorkshire and onto the global stage, initiating a chain of events that would end in fire, murder, and the permanent alteration of the British Isles. In February 1565, the 19-year-old Lord Darnley crossed the border into Scotland, armed with his royal pedigree and an immense ego. His arrival at the Scottish court was not merely a diplomatic visit. It was the ignition of a fuse that would violently detonate the fragile balance of power in the British Isles. To understand the catastrophic sequence of events that followed, one must analyze the profound visual fallacy that ensnared Mary, Queen of Scots. When Darnley arrived at Wemyss Castle to present himself to his cousin, he did not look like a treasonous usurper or a political liability. He looked like the embodiment of a Renaissance prince. In an era where the average male height hovered around 5 feet 7 inches, Darnley was a biological giant. He stood well over 6 feet tall. He possessed a robust athletic physique, broad shoulders, and a smooth, beardless, almost delicate, aristocratic face. Mary Stuart herself was an exceptionally tall woman, standing nearly 6 feet. For her entire life, she had been forced to physically look down upon her courtiers, her advisors, and her previous husband, the frail, sickly King Francis II of France. When she looked at Darnley, she experienced a profound psychological relief. She saw a man who could meet her eye to eye. Mary famously and fatally described him to her ambassador as the lustiest and best proportioned long man that she had ever seen. Mary was politically isolated. She was surrounded by battle-hardened, fiercely independent Protestant warlords who openly challenged her authority. She was desperate for a male consort who could act as a political counterweight, a protector who projected strength and military capability. Darnley's imposing physical stature perfectly masked his utter incompetence. Mary's brain made a fatal subconscious error. She equated his impressive biological architecture with political capability, intellectual depth, and martial prowess. She believed she was looking at a warrior king. She was actually looking at a hollow, highly unstable pawn. Beneath the velvet doublets and the glittering courtly facade, Darnley's lifestyle was a chaotic, rapid descent into depravity. Once he established himself in Edinburgh, he operated as a creature of the night. He constantly vanished from the royal palaces, plunging into the city's grim taverns, brothels, and dark alleyways. He drank heavily, recklessly, and publicly, demanding total deference from Scottish nobles who secretly despised his arrogance and English upbringing. The biological consequences of this unchecked hedonism were severe and rapid. Many modern medical historians argue that in the filthy underbelly of Edinburgh, Darnley contracted a virulent strain of syphilis, known at the time as the Great Pox, or the French disease. The Scottish court and his political handlers desperately attempted to cover up his deteriorating health. They officially referred to his frequent, agonizing illnesses as bouts of measles or winter smallpox. But the physical reality was horrific. If he indeed suffered from the progression of syphilis, the bacteria aggressively colonized his body. He suffered from severe weeping ulcers across his torso and limbs. He experienced sudden hair loss, forcing him to rely on elaborate hats and coverings. Eventually, the lesions began to disfigure his face. The supposedly beautiful prince was forced to wear a black taffeta mask to hide his decaying flesh, and weeping sores when receiving certain visitors or walking through the drafty corridors of Holyrood House. He was a walking contradiction, a man whose entire political value was based on his physical appearance, literally rotting from the inside out. Even more terrifying than the dermatological horror was the internal neurological damage. As historical accounts describe his increasingly erratic behavior, it strongly aligns with the symptoms of neurosyphilis breaching the blood-brain barrier. This condition actively destroys the frontal lobe, the area of the brain responsible for impulse control, rational thought, and emotional regulation. Darnley's deeply ingrained arrogance escalated into extreme volatility. He exhibited unprovoked rage, intense paranoia, and a total lack of impulse control. He would violently assault lower-ranking servants and verbally humiliate powerful Scottish lords in public. The Golden Prince was rapidly devolving into an unpredictable, deeply dangerous monster, incapable of basic diplomacy or rational thought. Adding a dense layer of complexity to his personal and political life were the persistent historical records and contemporary court gossip regarding his sexual inclinations and intimate alliances. In the claustrophobic, heavily surveilled environment of the Scottish court, whispers circulated widely that Darnley indulged in unmanly pleasures. Most intriguing, and ultimately most fatal, were the undeniable records of his initially intense intimate relationship with David Rizzio. Rizzio was an Italian musician who had rapidly and controversially risen to become Mary's private foreign secretary and her most trusted confidant. Rizzio was despised by the Scottish Protestant lords. They viewed him as a foreign Catholic infiltrator whispering in the Queen's ear. When Darnley first arrived at court, he recognized that Rizzio held the keys to the Queen's favor. Darnley aggressively courted the Italian secretary. Eyewitnesses in the court noted that the two men became inseparable. They played tennis together, dined together, and, as was customary for close allies, in the 16th century, they frequently slept in the same bed. Whether this relationship was physically sexual, deeply emotional, or purely a cynical, manipulative political alliance designed by Darnley to gain access to the Queen, it established a profound intimacy. However, this intimacy was built on a transactional foundation. The moment Darnley realized that Rizzio possessed actual executive political power, while Darnley was merely being treated as a handsome figurehead, the affection rapidly soured. Darnley's volatile mind processed Rizzio's influence not as an asset, but as a direct insult to his royal blood. This shift from intimate alliance to toxic paranoid jealousy would soon culminate in one of the most brutal and intimate political murders in European history. The chain of events that allowed this unstable boy to infiltrate the Scottish court was triggered by a monumental, uncharacteristic miscalculation by one of history's sharpest political minds, Queen Elizabeth I of England. In early 1565, Elizabeth made a rare, blinding error in judgment. She officially granted the 19-year-old Darnley permission to leave London and travel north to Scotland. Elizabeth, backed by her spy master William Cecil, calculated this as a purely disruptive geopolitical maneuver. The Scottish nobility was already fractured into hostile factions, the Hamiltons, the Gordons, and the Protestant lords led by Moray. Elizabeth hypothesized that injecting the ambitious, legally potent Lennox family back into the Scottish ecosystem would act as a political grenade. She believed Darnley's presence would stir up deep internal divisions. This would force the Scottish lords to fight among themselves over property and influence, thereby keeping Queen Mary entirely distracted, weak, and incapable of posing a threat to the English border. What Elizabeth's vast intelligence network entirely failed to account for was human emotion and the severe psychological isolation of a fellow monarch. Elizabeth operated on cold, calculated logic. She did not anticipate that Mary Stuart, lonely, desperate for an ally, and visually overwhelmed by Darnley's physical stature, would immediately fall in love. Mary saw in Darnley the perfect tool to neutralize Elizabeth. By marrying Darnley, Mary would unite her own powerful claim to the English throne with Darnley's native-born English claim. This union would create a unified, legally impenetrable dynastic front. It would effectively corner Elizabeth I, forcing the English Parliament to acknowledge the Mary Darnley bloodline as the undeniable, legitimate heirs to the English crown. Once the mutual attraction was established, events moved with terrifying, uncontrollable speed. Mary, usually a cautious and highly deliberate politician, was blinded by a combination of genuine infatuation and the intoxicating prospect of securing the English succession. She ignored the frantic warnings of her advisors and the furious diplomatic protests from London. On July 29, 1565, Mary Stuart and Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, were married in a private Catholic ceremony at the Chapel Royal in the Palace of Holyrood House. The wedding was an act of supreme, almost reckless defiance against the established order of Europe. Because they were first cousins, Catholic canon law strictly required a papal dispensation to permit the marriage. Mary and Darnley, driven by haste and political momentum, married without waiting for the paperwork to arrive from Rome. This technically rendered the union illegal in the eyes of the church they claimed to champion. Furthermore, the ceremony provided a glaring public preview of Darnley's fundamental lack of character and religious conviction. After the vows were exchanged, the priest prepared to conduct the nuptial Catholic Mass, the most sacred ritual of Mary's faith and the ideological cornerstone of her reign. Darnley abruptly turned his back and walked out of the chapel. He abandoned his new wife at the altar. Demonstrating his characteristic petulance, he proved instantly that his Catholicism was merely a political costume. He cared nothing for the faith, only for the crown it could place upon his head. The political fallout from this marriage was immediate and severe. In London, Queen Elizabeth I erupted in unprecedented fury. An English citizen of royal blood had crossed an international border and married a foreign sovereign without obtaining explicit permission from his monarch, an act that legally constituted high treason. In swift retaliation, Elizabeth immediately ordered Darnley's mother, Lady Margaret Douglas, arrested and thrown into the damp, freezing dungeons of the Tower of London. Elizabeth also ordered the immediate seizure of all Lennox estates, wealth, and properties located on English soil, effectively bankrupting Darnley's family overnight. In Scotland, the reaction was military. The Protestant nobility, led by Mary's half-brother, the Earl of Moray, panicked. They viewed the marriage to the Catholic Darnley as the first step in a bloody counter-reformation that would strip them of their lands and reinstate papal authority. Funded by secret gold shipments from Queen Elizabeth, Moray and his allies launched an open armed rebellion against the crown, a conflict that became known as the Chaseabout Raid. It was during this intense military crisis, mere weeks into their marriage, that the magnificent illusion of Lord Darnley completely and permanently shattered for Mary, Queen of Scots. As the rebel armies mobilized, Mary proved her formidable mettle. She personally strapped on steel armor, mounted a war horse, and rode at the head of her royal troops. She braved severe autumn storms to hunt down the rebels across the Scottish Highlands. She was a sovereign defending her realm. Her new king consort, however, proved utterly useless. Given command of forces on the battlefield, Darnley displayed a staggering, humiliating mix of physical cowardice and strategic incompetence. He possessed no martial skill, no ability to lead men, and a desperate desire to avoid physical danger. He was a liability in the command tent and a joke among the seasoned soldiers. The facade was completely gone. Mary realized with chilling clarity that she had not married a warrior, a protector, or an equal. She had married a violent, sickly, incompetent boy. The brief, fiery romance evaporated, replaced instantly by profound buyer's remorse and deep political dread. She had shackled herself and her kingdom to a liability, but Darnley, entirely blind to his own monumental failings and driven by his volatile ego, did not see himself as a liability. He saw himself as the rightful king of Scotland, and he was about to initiate a campaign of high treason against his own wife to seize total control of the nation. The crisis within the royal marriage rapidly escalated from a matter of personal disappointment into a brutal, high-stakes struggle for executive power. Queen Mary, now acutely aware of her husband's crippling alcoholism, his intellectual vacuum, and his worsening instability, took immediate steps to isolate him from the machinery of the state. She systematically began stripping him of actual authority. When state documents required the signatures of both the queen and the king consort, Darnley was frequently too intoxicated, absent, or indifferent to fulfill his duties. In a symbolic and humiliating move, Mary ordered the creation of an iron stamp bearing Darnley's signature. She handed this stamp to David Rizzio, allowing her secretary to authorize documents without Darnley even being in the room. Darnley was no longer a co-ruler. He had been reduced to a piece of office equipment. Driven by his monstrous entitlement and unable to accept his own glaring inadequacies, Darnley's response was not to improve his conduct, but to demand more power. He began relentlessly pressuring Mary, the Scottish Parliament, and the Privy Council to formally grant him the crown matrimonial. To the modern observer, the crown matrimonial sounds like a ceremonial honor, a mere title reflecting his status as the Queen's husband. In the context of 16th century constitutional law, it was a terrifying transfer of power. Granting Darnley the crown matrimonial would legally elevate him to the status of a full executive co-sovereign. He would possess the right to call parliaments, raise armies, and dictate foreign policy independent of the Queen. Most critically, the crown matrimonial contained a devastating succession clause. If Mary were to die childless before him, a probable scenario given the staggering maternal mortality rates of the era, the throne of Scotland would not pass to the next legitimate Stuart heir. It would pass automatically and permanently to Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley. It would effectively erase the Stuart dynasty and hand an entire nation over to the exiled Lennox faction. Mary Stuart firmly and correctly utilized her royal prerogative to deny him. She flatly refused to hand the legal mechanisms of her country over to a violently unstable teenager. His ego profoundly bruised, his ambitions thwarted, and his daily existence relegated to ceremonial irrelevance. Darnley committed the ultimate act of political self-destruction. He committed high treason against his own wife and his sovereign. He reached out to the very men who openly despised him, the exiled, heavily armed Protestant lords who had recently attempted to overthrow the Queen during the Chase-About raid. These battle-hardened, cynical politicians, specifically the Earl of Morton, Lord Ruthven, and Lord Lindsay, recognized a golden opportunity. They were facing total ruin. Queen Mary was preparing to convene a session of Parliament that would officially pass an act of forfeiture against them, permanently confiscating their vast estates, wealth, and ancestral lands. They needed to stop that Parliament from convening at all costs. They needed a blunt instrument to shatter the Queen's government, and the angry, deeply naive king consort was the perfect weapon. The lords easily manipulated the boy. They recognized that Darnley's primary psychological vulnerability was his intense pathological jealousy. They needed a target to focus his rage, and they chose David Rizzio. Rizzio, as the Queen's private secretary, controlled the flow of patronage, correspondence, and access to the monarch. He was a foreigner, a Catholic, and a commoner, making him universally hated by the Scottish aristocracy. The Protestant lords began a deliberate, systematic campaign of psychological warfare against Darnley. They fed his paranoia, whispering in the dark corridors of the palace that Rizzio was not merely a secretary, but a usurper who had stolen the king's rightful place in the government. They then deployed the most lethal, destabilizing lie possible in a patriarchal monarchy. They convinced Darnley that the 6-month fetus Queen Mary was currently carrying did not belong to him, but was the bastard child of the hunched Italian secretary. In Darnley's fragile, deteriorating mind, this was the ultimate betrayal. Driven by spite and a desperate thirst for power, Darnley entered into a formal treasonous conspiracy. He signed a physical blood pact known as the Band with the rebel lords. The terms of the contract were chillingly transactional. The Protestant lords promised to use their military leverage to force the Scottish Parliament to grant Darnley the crown matrimonial, recognizing him as the supreme, unchallengeable ruler of Scotland. In exchange, Darnley agreed to pardon all the rebels from the Chaseabout raid. He would officially protect the Protestant faith against any Catholic resurgence, restore the lords' confiscated lands, and provide the royal cover and legal amnesty required for the premeditated assassination of David Rizzio. The murder of David Rizzio was never intended to be a quiet, efficient assassination carried out in a dark alley. It was a highly orchestrated theatrical act of physical and psychological terrorism aimed squarely at the physical body and the mind of the Queen of Scots. The objective of the lords was twofold: execute the secretary and subject the pregnant monarch to such extreme, traumatic shock that she would either suffer a fatal miscarriage or be terrified into signing away her crown to her husband on the spot. The mechanics of the assassination were flawlessly engineered to maximize terror. It took place on the freezing night of Saturday, March 9th, 1566, deep inside the palace of Holyrood House. To understand the sheer claustrophobia of the event, one must examine the geography of the crime scene. Mary was dining in her private supper room. This chamber was microscopic, measuring barely 13 feet by 13 feet. It was intimately lit by candles and a small fireplace. Mary, heavily pregnant and highly vulnerable, was seated at a small table with Rizzio, her half-sister, the Countess of Argyll, and a few close attendants. The room had 2 points of entry. One was the main door connecting to the Queen's presence chamber, which was heavily guarded. The second was a narrow, secret spiral staircase that led directly downward into Darnley's personal bedchamber. At approximately 8 p.m., Darnley utilized his exclusive access to the secret staircase. He emerged into the tiny supper room alone. He approached his wife, placed his arm around her waist, and sat beside her, acting with feigned affection. His entrance was the signal. He had successfully breached the perimeter and trapped the Queen. Moments later, the heavy tapestry covering the secret door was thrown aside. The nightmare stepped into the room. It was Patrick Ruthven, Third Lord Ruthven. Ruthven was suffering from a terminal illness, likely severe gastric cancer. He had literally risen from his deathbed to participate in the coup. He entered the candlelit room wearing heavy steel plate armor over a nightgown. His face was deathly pale, he was sweating profusely, and he looked like a man on the brink of death. The shock of his appearance froze the room. Speaking in a hollow, rasping voice, Ruthven drew his dagger, pointed it directly at Rizzio, and demanded the secretary step out of the Queen's presence, stating he had been there overlong. Mary, instantly recognizing the threat, stood up. She invoked her royal authority, commanding Ruthven to leave her private chambers immediately under pain of treason. But royal authority had already been suspended by the treasonous pact. Upon Mary's refusal, the main doors to the presence chamber were violently smashed open. Dozens of heavily armed, armored rebel lords and mercenaries surged into the microscopic 13-foot room. The dining table was violently flipped over, sending plates, food, and heavy iron candlesticks crashing to the floor, plunging the room into chaotic, flickering shadows. Rizzio, realizing instantly that he was a dead man, cowered behind the pregnant queen. He clutched desperately at the heavy pleats of her gown, screaming in Italian, "Giustizia, giustizia, sauve ma vie, madame, sauve ma vie." Justice, justice, save my life, madame, save my life. Amidst the violent struggle in the darkened room, the psychological terrorism reached its peak. Andrew Kerr of Fawdenside, a ruthless border lord, drew a heavy, loaded horse pistol. He lunged forward and pressed the cocked muzzle directly against the queen's swollen, 6-month pregnant belly. He explicitly threatened to pull the trigger, executing both the monarch and her unborn child on the spot if she did not step aside and surrender her secretary. Simultaneously, another lord held a cold dagger to Mary's throat. Darnley, the architect of this horror, stood by watching. He actively restrained his pregnant wife so she could not intervene as her closest confidant was ripped from her skirts. Rizzio was violently dragged screaming from the supper room, through the queen's bedchamber, and into the outer audience chamber. What followed was not a clean execution, but a frenzied, chaotic slaughter. The mob of lords fell upon the secretary, stabbing him blindly and repeatedly. Forensic analysis of the historical accounts confirms Rizzio was stabbed 56 times. In criminology, inflicting 56 stab wounds on a single unarmed victim is classified as severe overkill. It indicates a state of extreme collective rage. It also served a psychological need for every conspirator to physically participate in the bloodletting, thereby sharing the legal guilt and ensuring shared complicity among the ranks. But the most cynical, calculating act of the night occurred in the aftermath of the stabbing. George Douglas, the illegitimate son of the Earl of Angus, and a close relative of Darnley, leaned over the mutilated corpse. He deliberately snatched Darnley's personal custom-made dagger from the king consort's belt. Douglas plunged the blade deep into Rizzio's lifeless body and intentionally left it buried in the flesh. This was not an accident. It was an insurance policy. By leaving Darnley's recognizable weapon in the victim, the Protestant lords manufactured undeniable physical proof of Darnley's active sponsorship of the murder. They had perfect blackmail material. Darnley was now legally, publicly, and irreversibly tied to a political assassination. As the blood pooled on the floorboards of Holyrood House, the palace went into immediate lockdown. The Queen's loyal guards were overpowered and disarmed. The gates were barred. Mary, Queen of Scots, was now a hostage in her own home, trapped in a blood-soaked palace surrounded by heavily armed traitors. Darnley stood amidst the wreckage of the royal apartments, believing he had achieved total victory. He believed he had eliminated his rival, terrified his wife into submission, and secured his path to supreme power. He was too arrogant and politically blind to realize that he had just signed his own death warrant. He had handed the most dangerous men in Scotland the perfect weapon to destroy him. In doing so, he had permanently, fatally alienated the one person who could have saved his life, his wife. In the immediate blood-soaked aftermath of David Rizzio's slaughter, the palace of Holyrood House was transformed into a heavily fortified prison. Queen Mary was held hostage in her own apartments, surrounded by the heavily armed, treasonous Protestant lords who had just butchered her closest confidant. Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, paced the corridors, operating under the catastrophic delusion that he had orchestrated a masterstroke. He believed he had successfully terrified his wife into submission and cleared his path to the crown matrimonial. However, Darnley had fundamentally miscalculated the psychological fortitude of Mary, Queen of Scots. The assassination was explicitly designed to break her, to induce a fatal miscarriage, or to force her to sign away her sovereignty in a state of paralyzing shock. But Mary did not break. Instead of collapsing into hysteria, her survival instincts overrode her trauma. She engaged in a masterclass of cold, calculated psychological manipulation. She turned her weakness into her most potent weapon against the weakest link in the conspiracy, her own husband. Over the next 48 hours, Mary weaponized Darnley's own crippling cowardice and paranoia against him. Granted private access to her husband, she dropped the facade of the terrified, submissive wife and coldly analyzed the political reality of his situation. She methodically dismantled his delusions of grandeur. She pointed out the undeniable, brutal track record of the men he had aligned himself with. The Earl of Morton and Lord Ruthven were hardened, ruthless warlords. She calmly explained to Darnley that he was merely a blunt instrument they had used to execute their coup. Mary laid out the inescapable logic. The moment the lords officially seized the apparatus of the government and the treasury, they would have no further use for an arrogant English-born teenager. Why would they share power with a boy they openly mocked? She convinced him that his co-conspirators were already plotting to depose him, imprison him, or quietly assassinate him once his political utility was exhausted. His fragile ego crumbled into sheer panic. He lacked the intellectual capacity to formulate his own strategy. When faced with the terrifying prospect of his own murder, his innate cowardice took complete control. He instantly folded. In a staggering display of disloyalty, Darnley completely abandoned the lords he had signed a blood oath with just days prior, throwing himself entirely upon the mercy of the wife he had just betrayed. Mary immediately capitalized on his panic. On the night of March 11th, 1566, she orchestrated a daring high-risk escape. Mary, 6 months pregnant and risking severe physical trauma, was led by Darnley down through the dark, winding wine cellars of the palace. They navigated through the abbey burial grounds to avoid the rebel guards. They mounted waiting horses and fled into the freezing, pitch-black Scottish night, riding relentlessly for the heavily fortified safety of Dunbar Castle on the coast. Once secure behind the massive stone walls of Dunbar, Mary rallied her loyalist forces. The rebellion led by the assassins rapidly collapsed without the Queen in their custody. But it was Darnley's subsequent actions that sealed his ultimate fate. Desperate to avoid the legal consequences of high treason, Darnley issued a brazen, highly public royal proclamation. He officially and categorically denied having any prior knowledge of or involvement in the conspiracy to murder David Rizzio. He shamelessly threw the entire faction of Protestant lords under the bus. He left them exposed to charges of treason and murder without the royal amnesty he had explicitly promised them. In retaliation for this breathtaking, cowardly double betrayal, the infuriated lords unleashed their ultimate weapon. As they fled into exile in England, they sent Queen Mary a package. Inside was the physical document of the band, the written assassination contract. At the bottom of the document was the undeniable, indisputable signature of Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley. For Mary, this was the final, irrefutable forensic proof of her husband's treachery. He had not merely been a passive observer. He was the primary sponsor of a plot that had held a loaded gun to her unborn child. From that exact moment, Darnley achieved an unprecedented state of political and personal isolation. He was deeply loathed and physically repulsed by his wife, who now viewed him with icy, permanent contempt. He was distrusted by the Catholic factions, who recognized he had no genuine religious loyalty. And crucially, the highly dangerous, heavily armed Protestant lords whom he had lured into a conspiracy and then abandoned were now swearing blood oaths of revenge against him. He was a man entirely without a country, without a faction, and without a friend. On June 19, 1566, the geopolitical landscape shifted again. Following a grueling, agonizing labor in the tiny confines of Edinburgh Castle, Mary gave birth to a healthy son, Prince James. The moment the infant took his first breath, the last remaining shred of Darnley's political utility evaporated completely. His sole value to the Scottish realm had been his biological capacity to act as a royal sire and secure the Tudor-Stuart succession. With an heir now sleeping in the nursery, the king consort was officially obsolete. When Darnley was finally permitted to visit the child, the encounter was a masterpiece of cold political theater. Mary publicly presented the baby to Darnley in front of witnesses, officially acknowledging Darnley as the father to legally secure the child's legitimacy and prevent any future succession disputes based on the Rizzio rumors. However, the acknowledgement was purely clinical. There was no reconciliation. Mary had secured her dynasty. She was now actively planning how to govern Scotland entirely without him. By the end of 1566, Darnley's ostracization was total, public, and deeply humiliating. This was most glaringly evident at the spectacular internationally attended baptism of Prince James at Stirling Castle in December. The baptism was designed by Mary to be a massive public relations triumph. It showcased the stability and wealth of her reign to the Catholic and Protestant powers of Europe. Ambassadors from France, England, and Savoy arrived bearing lavish, jewel-encrusted gifts. Elaborate fireworks, displays, and grand banquets were hosted in the Great Hall, yet the king consort, the biological father of the child being celebrated, was effectively barred from the ceremonies. Darnley was physically present within the walls of Stirling Castle, but he refused to step out of his private apartments. His absence was a complex mixture of political protocol and physical deterioration. The English ambassador, representing Queen Elizabeth I, had been given strict, unyielding orders from London. He was to categorically refuse to acknowledge Darnley's title of king. For Darnley to appear in public and be openly snubbed by the representative of his native country would have been an intolerable humiliation to his massive ego. Furthermore, his health had reportedly progressed to a visible state of decay. His body was covered in weeping sores, and his physical deterioration was becoming impossible to mask with fine clothing. While the courts of Europe celebrated the future of the Scottish monarchy in the chapels below, the architect of that future sat isolated in a dark, drafty room. He was nursing a deeply bruised ego, drowning his paranoia in heavy alcohol, and watching his physical body fail. He was entirely unaware that while he sulked in his chambers, the true power brokers of Scotland were already convening in secret, actively engineering the precise mechanics of his violent removal. While Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, sulked in his isolated chambers during the spectacular baptism of his son in December 1566, the true power brokers of the Scottish realm were deciding his permanent fate. The political paralysis caused by the king consort's erratic behavior, his failing health, and his treasonous history could no longer be sustained. In late November, a clandestine, highly consequential meeting took place at Craigmillar Castle, a fortress situated just outside Edinburgh. The inner circle of the Scottish government convened. This faction included the Earl of Bothwell, a fiercely loyal and ruthlessly ambitious military commander. Also present were the Earl of Moray, William Maitland, the Secretary of State, the Earl of Huntly, and the Earl of Argyll. Their objective was singular: solve the Darnley problem. The council immediately and categorically ruled out the legal avenue of divorce. A royal divorce in the 16th century would instantly throw the legal legitimacy of the infant Prince James into question. If Mary's marriage to Darnley was annulled, James could be declared a bastard, plunging the nation right back into a bloody multi-factional succession crisis. The Tudor-Stuart bloodline, which they had sacrificed so much to secure, had to remain legally pristine. Therefore, the solution had to be extra-legal. The Lords forged a secret treasonous pact known to history as the Craigmillar Bond. They collectively agreed to deal with Darnley permanently, utilizing lethal force outside the boundaries of the law. However, there was one strict, foundational stipulation to this conspiracy. The deed must be executed in a manner that left Queen Mary's honor unstained and her political plausible deniability intact. The countdown to the assassination had officially begun. By early January 1567, Darnley's illness had flared up violently, incapacitating him. He fled to his family's stronghold in Glasgow, where he was bedridden, covered in weeping pustules, and suffering from severe fevers. In a heavily debated and deeply controversial move, Mary personally rode to Glasgow. She spent days by his bedside and successfully persuaded the terrified, paranoid king consort to return to Edinburgh to convalesce under her care. However, upon their return to the capital, Darnley was not taken to the heavily guarded fortified safety of Holyrood House or Edinburgh Castle. Instead, he was isolated at a location known as Kirk was the former house of the Provost of St. Mary in the Fields. Its geographical setup was deeply ominous and strategically vulnerable. The house was situated on the outskirts of the city, pressing right against the southern Flodden Wall. It was relatively isolated from the main Royal Guard garrisons. Darnley was placed in a small upper-floor bedroom. In a move that suggested close marital reconciliation, Mary took the room directly beneath his, spending her evenings reading to him and playing music. Beneath this facade of domestic recovery, a massive logistical operation was underway. In the days leading up to the murder, henchmen working directly under the command of the Earl of Bothwell systematically smuggled dozens of wooden barrels filled with military-grade gunpowder into the building. The structural integrity of the house was being turned into a bomb. Historical sources strongly suggest that at least 14 heavy barrels of powder were secretly stacked in the Queen's lower room, placed directly under the floorboards supporting Darnley's bed. The trap was fully primed by the weekend of February 9th, 1567. On that Sunday evening, Mary spent several hours with her husband, engaging in seemingly normal conversation. Then, she suddenly announced that she had forgotten a prior commitment. She was required to return to Holyrood House to attend the wedding masquerade of her personal servant, Bastian Pages. Her abrupt departure was the catalyst. It withdrew the royal security detail and the bulk of the household staff, leaving Darnley entirely exposed in the dark. At approximately 2 a.m. on Monday, February 10th, the fuse was lit. A catastrophic, earth-shattering explosion violently ripped through the freezing Scottish winter night. The blast was so immensely powerful that it woke the entire sleeping city of Edinburgh. The shockwave utterly pulverized the stone structure of Kirk. It did not merely damage the house, it leveled the building to its very foundations, hurling massive masonry blocks across the surrounding fields. What remained of the royal lodging was a smoking ruined crater. However, when the city guard, investigators, and terrified townsfolk rushed to the scene with torches, they were confronted with a crime scene that defied all laws of physics and explosives. The corpses of Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, and his loyal valet, William Taylor, were not buried beneath the tons of collapsed masonry. They were not found inside the footprint of the destroyed house at all. Their bodies were discovered roughly 40 to 80 feet away, lying under a pear tree in the adjacent south garden, completely separated from the blast zone by a high, intact stone wall. Furthermore, the forensic condition of both bodies presented a glaring paradox. They were entirely, immaculately intact. There were no burn marks or flash searing on their skin. There was no smell of sulfur, saltpeter, or gunpowder in their hair. They had not been struck by flying stone shrapnel, nor did they exhibit the massive internal hemorrhaging, shattered bones, or ruptured eardrums that are biologically consistent with the overwhelming overpressure wave of a gunpowder blast. In the dead of a freezing Scottish winter, both men were dressed only in thin linen nightshirts. Scattered near their bodies in the garden were bizarrely specific out-of-place items: a wooden chair, a length of heavy rope, a velvet cloak, and a dagger. Medical examinations conducted by surgeons the following morning quickly confirmed what the naked eye could deduce. These men did not die in a fire. They did not die from the shock wave of an explosion. They exhibited distinct mechanical ligature marks, broken cartilage in the throat, and severe bruising around their necks, jaws, and faces. Henry Stuart and his servant had been manually strangled or smothered to death. The physical evidence pointed to a terrifying, highly coordinated reality. The king consort was murdered before the house was blown up. Based on the most compelling forensic interpretations of the evidence, the grim reality of his final moments unfolded as a desperate struggle for survival. Lying in his bed, driven by his illness-induced paranoia, his insomnia, and his heightened nervous system, Darnley likely heard the heavy thud of the assassins moving the gunpowder barrels in the room below. Or perhaps he smelled the distinct acrid odor of saltpeter leaking from the casks. Realizing a trap had been sprung and that the house was compromised, sheer panic set in. There was no time to dress in armor or heavy winter clothes. He grabbed his velvet cloak and a dagger for defense. Finding the interior doors locked or guarded by Bothwell's men, he and Taylor improvised a desperate exit strategy. They tied a heavy rope to a chair, anchored it securely to a structural beam on the upper floor, and shinnied down from the window into the pitch-black garden below. They believed they had escaped the blast radius, but an assassination plot of this magnitude, orchestrated by seasoned, battle-hardened military men like Bothwell or the ruthless Douglas clan, would never rely solely on unpredictable explosives. They had established a perimeter. The assassins needed the murder to be clinically clean and untraceable. Executing their plan, they physically pinned the giant weakened king to the freezing ground. Using their bare hands, a wet towel, or the very rope he had used to escape the house, they strangled the breath out of him. The murder was intimate, quiet, and brutally efficient. Minutes after Darnley took his last gasping breath under the pear tree, the assassins triggered the massive cache of gunpowder inside the house. The colossal explosion was never meant to be the mechanism of death. It was a state-sponsored act of misdirection. It was explicitly designed to obliterate the original crime scene, destroy any physical evidence left in the bedrooms, and mask a targeted political strangulation as a chaotic act of terror. The bizarre, humiliating death of Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, in the frozen gardens of Kirk did not resolve the political crisis of Scotland. It acted as the violent catalyst that would bring a queen to her knees and fundamentally redraw the map of Europe. The morning after the murder, the streets of Edinburgh became ground zero for a sophisticated, devastating psychological warfare campaign. The city was littered with anonymous treasonous placards nailed to the heavy wooden doors of the toll booth and the market cross. These broadsides pointed the finger directly at the Earl of Bothwell as the mastermind of the assassination. Even more destructively, they depicted Queen Mary as a mermaid, a widely recognized 16th century iconographic symbol for a prostitute, a siren, and a willing, adulterous conspirator in the slaughter of her own husband. The propaganda war had begun, and Darnley's corpse was instantly transformed from a royal liability into the most powerful political weapon in the British Isles. Faced with a murdered king consort and a populace baying for blood, Mary Stuart made a series of catastrophic, inexplicable errors in judgment that shattered her reign. Rather than immediately distancing herself from the prime suspect and launching an aggressive, independent investigation to hunt down her husband's killers, she allowed the Earl of Bothwell to dictate the terms of justice. Under immense public pressure, Bothwell was subjected to a trial on April 12, 1567. However, this was not a judicial proceeding. It was a brutal display of military intimidation. Bothwell packed the narrow cobblestone streets of Edinburgh with 4,000 heavily armed loyal mercenaries. He effectively held the judicial system hostage. Darnley's father, the Earl of Lennox, who had legally demanded the trial to avenge his son, was too terrified of assassination to even enter the city. With no prosecutor willing to present evidence against the most dangerous man in Scotland, the trial lasted barely 7 hours, ending in a swift, preordained acquittal. Bothwell walked out of the toll booth not just as a free man, but as a man who had successfully proven he was above the law. The ultimate political disaster occurred mere weeks later. Having secured his acquittal, Bothwell intercepted Queen Mary as she traveled toward Edinburgh. He abducted her. Whether she was a willing participant or a terrified hostage remains one of history's most fiercely debated questions, and took her to the impregnable fortress of Dunbar Castle. On May 15, 1567, a mere 3 months after Henry Stuart was strangled to death, Mary Stuart married the prime suspect of his murder in a Protestant ceremony. This single indefensible act destroyed her entirely. The optical fallout was disastrous. To the powerful Catholic courts of France and Spain, who had previously supported her claim to the English throne, she was no longer a tragic widow. She was an adulterous liability who had colluded with a heretic assassin. To the Protestant lords of Scotland, it provided the perfect legal and moral justification for a coup d'etat. The rebel lords, rapidly branding themselves as the Confederate lords, raised a massive army against the Queen. They weaponized Darnley's death with terrifying efficiency. Their battle standard was not a traditional clan crest. It was a massive, horrific, hand-painted canvas depicting Darnley's dead, naked body lying under the pear tree at Kirk Field. Beside the corpse knelt the infant Prince James, with a banner flowing from the child's mouth bearing the Latin inscription, "Judge and revenge my cause, O Lord." Mary's political and military support evaporated upon contact with this narrative. At the military standoff at Carberry Hill in June 1567, there was no bloody clash of swords. Her own army, demoralized by the propaganda and disgusted by her union with Bothwell, simply refused to fight. They deserted her in droves. Recognizing her total defeat, Mary surrendered to the lords to avoid a massacre. Bothwell was permitted to flee the field into exile, initiating a dark descent that would end with him dying hopelessly insane, chained to a stone pillar in the freezing dungeons of Dragsholm Castle in Denmark. Mary was taken prisoner and locked away in the grim, isolated island fortress of Lochleven Castle. There, physically exhausted, psychologically broken, and suffering from a severe miscarriage of twins fathered by Bothwell, she was forced under the direct threat of death to sign a document of abdication on July 24th, 1567. She officially surrendered the crown of Scotland to her one-year-old son, who was immediately crowned King James VI. The political consequences of Darnley's murder, however, continued to systematically dismantle his wife's reign. In May 1568, Mary managed a daring escape from Lochleven, following a final disastrous military defeat at the Battle of Langside. She fled across the Solway Firth into England. She begged her cousin, Queen Elizabeth I, for sanctuary and military assistance to reclaim her throne. Instead of an ally, she walked directly into a meticulously engineered legal trap. The Scottish regents, desperate to legitimize their coup and keep Mary out of Scotland, presented Queen Elizabeth with the ultimate forensic weapon, the casket letters. This collection of documents, reportedly discovered in a silver casket belonging to one of Bothwell's servants, contained 8 letters, 2 marriage contracts, and 12 sonnets, allegedly written by Mary to Bothwell. They explicitly plotted Darnley's murder and their subsequent abduction. Modern forensic historians, notably John Guy, have rigorously analyzed these texts and the circumstances of their discovery. Their research heavily indicates that critical portions of the letters were blatant forgeries. They were highly sophisticated composites, heavily spliced and interpolated by Mary's enemies, specifically William Maitland, designed to frame her and ensure she remained a political prisoner. However, to the English government in 1568, the objective truth of the letters was entirely irrelevant. Their political utility was paramount. Elizabeth's chief advisor, William Cecil, seized upon the casket letters as the legal justification to neutralize the primary threat to the English crown. Because Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, had been born an English citizen of royal blood, the English government claimed legal jurisdiction to investigate his murder. Elizabeth used the perpetual unresolved suspicion surrounding Darnley's assassination to justify holding Mary Stuart under strict house arrest. The trap sprang shut, and it remained locked for the next 19 years. The chain of events sparked by the gunpowder at Kirk and the forged letters directly paved the path to the Great Hall at Fotheringhay Castle, where Mary, Queen of Scots, was finally executed by beheading in February 1587. Darnley's death achieved the geopolitical masterstroke that his life could not. His assassination ultimately separated the infant Prince James from Mary, placing the boy under the control of strict Protestant regents. When Queen Elizabeth I died childless in 1603, James claimed the English throne without shedding a drop of blood, unifying the British Isles and fulfilling his family's long-held ambition. The explosion at Kirk ended a monarchy and dragged a queen to the executioner's block. Though Darnley lived as an unstable narcissist entirely unworthy of the crown he craved, his bloodline undeniably laid the foundation for the modern British Empire,